When I was a young man in college, I went on a junior year abroad and I went to London. And it was 1987. And I felt very much at odds with the culture of the US, which seemed to be moving in a direction that I at that time thought was terribly bellicose and monocultural and conservative and not interested in the rich connection to the past that I was discovering in the humanities with Shakespeare and Sophocles and Plato and so on. It seemed like everything was being watered down, and I saw cynicism everywhere. I wanted to be an idealist. It was full of young person's passions. And I clicked around on the TV, and I saw something I'd never heard of, a docudrama about the Prague Spring, which took place in the year I was born, in 1968, in
Mm.
Czechoslovakia, where Alexander Dubček, the insurgent candidate, rose against Novotny in the Central Committee and advocated for something called socialism with a human face. Well, I flipped my young wig about this and thought, a utopian project with legs at last. Of course, it was crushed by the Soviets just a few months later. And nobody really knows how well that would have gone. But Dubček, did, while he was in power briefly, liberalize the political system and make Jeffersonian space for argument and discourse, which meant that learning and universities could have a pragmatic effect on having the force of the better argument carry the day, rather than might makes right or bribery defining all the outcomes and so on. I thought, here is some idealism. So I did what you do when you're a young man in Long Island and you like something. I painted it on the back of my denim jacket. And
Okay.
I wrote, Prague Spring, the flag of Czechoslovakia, Alexander Dubček, Prague Spring, Zdeněk Mlynář, Ivan Kral, who is Czech, but who was the bass player for the Patti Smith group. But that was another one of my obsessions at the time. So I threw his name on there too. František Kriegel, Josef Smrkovsky, Josef Spacek. And I put this jacket on and went not to Czechoslovakia, but to London. I studied poetry. I became intoxicated with Shelley and with Shakespeare and with John Keats and Yeats and Donne and Lowell and Larkin, and memorized several thousand lines of poetry under the tutelage of a brilliant man who died 6 years ago. I've just written an elegy about him because my wife and I crossed the ocean a week ago, and went to Highgate Cemetery to look at his grave. Colin Falck wrote a brilliant book called Myth, Truth, and Literature, which I draw on in my book Into Theism. And the semester ended, and I now had a month opportunity to do whatever, and no plan. So I went to a thrift store, and I picked up a pamphlet about the pre-Celtic, pre-Christian monuments of the Welsh island of Anglesey, the furthest point westward in the British Isles before Ireland. And you can see the Emerald Isle on a clear day. And I hitchhiked there and decided to take all the photographs that were in this black and white glossy pamphlet from 1951, but from the same angles and the same distances and in color. This I did. I was ill-equipped for this, didn't have a knapsack, I had a suitcase. It was the most arbitrary, preposterous plan. But at 19, this is what I did. One night, on the Welsh island of Anglesey, where there were more sheep than people, a barely electrified place which, when it got dark, was very dark indeed, and I saw a glimmering of a farmhouse as the batteries in my flashlight began to fade, and I dreaded the prospect of sleeping outside all night in the cold. And I approached the farmhouse, and I knocked on the door, hoping for advice about where the next inn might be. And I was wearing this jacket. I'm in the middle of nowhere, in a very sparsely populated place in the British Isles. And I knock on the door as it's getting dark, and it opens, and a woman's face appears. And she says, "I cannot help you. My husband is not home." And I think, surely she's Russian. What are the odds that she could possibly be Czech? But I figure there is a chance I will pause in the doorway. And I did. And I heard, "Wait a moment. My father taught Smirkovsky's daughter to play the violin." And she invited me in and made me an omelet, which I call the rescue omelet. and gave me a map of where the next place was to go and some fresh batteries for the flashlight, and off I went. And this was and remains the most striking coincidence of my entire life. I was searching for such a thing. It was the point of visiting these Celtic monuments. It was an expedition to see if the sacred, if the holy, could be encountered in the world outside of the tradition into which I was born, outside of a scientific mindset which was prepared to encounter it, but only under rarefied conditions, atop a tower of intellectual effort. And out I went into the landscape of the British Isles that had produced the spirits with whom I was so deeply in love. Percy Bysshe Shelley, William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe. Flawed figures all, but gifted with a kind of genius that really lit the way for my life. And that bizarre coincidence, it did not throw a switch which showed me, obviously, God is real. It instead provided a kind of gradient that made it much easier. It was no longer such an uphill battle. It was, well, you remember what happened. It seemed like a kind of wink, a kind of wordless communication, and it happened at a season of my life when I was actively looking for it.